Good afternoon. It's funny when you get up to this podium, it says, "Attention, speak loudly." So those are my instructions. I hope you can hear me. You know, it has been a joy to work on this program committee with such super competent and committed people like Garland Young and Frank Stith and many others who contributed to it. I'm just meeting some of them today because a lot of the work was done by conference call. But thank you for that honor. It's been a joy. And as we discussed the program, and how it was fitting together, it became clear that we needed a very special person to fill a key role. We needed someone with a deep, comprehensive understanding of the theory and practice of nonviolence as taught by Gandhi and King. We needed somebody with a track record who could pull together that foundation in a succinct, comprehensible way. We needed someone who could inspire and engage the audience at the sleepiest time of day, after lunch. And I said, "Oh, you're talking about Michael Nagler." It was my very good fortune a few years back to work with Michael Nagler at the Metta Center for Nonviolence. Now, I had read his book, The Search for a Nonviolent Future, which I hope you all get a copy of either while you're here or later. And I'd seen videos of his lectures, but nothing could match being on hand for those informal conversations, for those staff meetings, for those unplanned ponderings and strategizing. I could get an immediate answer to my questions, which were many. Michael is a walking encyclopedia on the subjects of Gandhi and nonviolence, and he has a gift for telling inspiring stories of courage and success. Michael is one of those rare talents who reads all his sources in the original language, so he was always blowing my mind with, you know, he'd read something or coming out with phrases in foreign languages, and he'd read Hindi and speaks to the Indians in their native language when they come. But, you know, by now you're much aware of his background as he's been introduced a couple of times. So, and there's more in your packet. So what I'd like to emphasize is that he is the president and founder of the Metta Center for Nonviolence, which I think is his major project right now. And so check out mettacenter.org. That's Metta with 2 T's, mettacenter.org, for a wealth of resources, materials, information on nonviolence, and you can download Michael's lectures. He is the author of Our Spiritual Crisis, The Search for a Nonviolent Future, which, by the way, received a 2002 American Book Award and has been translated into Arabic, Italian, Korean, Croatian, and several other languages by Michael himself. No, just kidding. But he probably could have done it. We've got it in English, fortunately. And I consider it a must-read for understanding nonviolence in its fullness. Other writings of his have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, every venue from the Wall Street Journal to Yes Magazine, if you're familiar with that. But that's his resume. I'd just like to share a couple of very special qualities that I learned from working with Michael. As a career professor, he knows how to engage young people. His warmth, his wisdom, and his humor endear him to everyone. But he really knows how to speak to our budding young peacemakers, and I just love that quality about him. And the second thing is, and this was extremely important to me and to my understanding of nonviolence, is his unfailing commitment to a spiritual practice and spiritual growth ongoing. He teaches and practices that some form of spiritual practice is needed to prepare the mind and heart for the daily challenges to our own intention to be nonviolent and to those occasional exceptional challenges that require us to draw up love for a fierce adversary, such as Dr. Lafayette was describing last night. Michael is a student of Sri Eknatheshwaran, founder of the Blue Mountain Center of Meditation. He has lived at the center's ashram in Marin County since 1970 and as a presenter for their programs on passage meditation. In summary, Michael has spoken and written about nonviolence, meditation, and world peace for over 30 years and become one of the most respected scholars and advocates of Gandhi and nonviolence in the world. And so now I will step aside and let you hear from him. I'm honored to present to you my friend and mentor, Dr. Michael Nagler.
There are many things that I love about Betsy, and you do also, but one of them is I don't have to pull the microphone down after she's introduced me. Before I begin, for whenever I say that, it reminds me of Richard Nixon got up to give a speech one time, and he said, "Before I start my speech, I want to say something." I thought you might appreciate that. But before I launch into my talks, our executive director from the Metta Center is here with me today, and I have a list of things that I must tell you about the Metta Center, or else it will be a very unpleasant trip home for me. So one is, Betsy has already mentioned several times the talks that were part of my course, PAX 164A, which was Theory and Practice of Nonviolence, and 164B, which was Nonviolence Today. I do occasionally get a really good idea, and I got the idea to have those talks webcast. The first time, I didn't know at the time it was the last time that I ever taught that course after 25 years. So they're now there for posterity. After the first 6 months, they had been visited by over 100,000 people. I'm not saying they all finished to the end, but they heard most of the really bad jokes that are packed in at the beginning. So those are on our website, and you can get to those directly from our homepage. There's a tab called Nonviolence 101. You can see you can get Nagler out of the university, but you can't get the university out of Nagler. We have downloads available for you of various talks on Gandhi, and you can find that under Research and Education. We have a new set of talks on constructive program. I'll be telling you more about that in a minute, and we have some CDs that are available with those talks, and those will be found under self-study. You can read about our current fellows. We have a regular ongoing system of fellowships, and that'll be under Research and Education. We have now a week-long curriculum for high schools which are required to conform to national standards, and yet we have found a way to insert the truth into those standards. We have a number of volunteer opportunities, and if you would see myself or Stephanie Van Hook afterwards, I'd be happy to talk to you about that. We pay the usual rate for volunteers, as the term volunteer implies. And we have a few copies of our brochure which describes a roadmap, which is going to be the last part of my talk with you today. And I hope some of you have noticed that poster that's on the back wall there, which is a blow-up of roadmap. And I'm very pleased to announce that our technical wizard, Patrick Kelly, is here with us today. He is going to make that into an interactive format so that you'll be able to click on that. Let's say you're interested in a particular issue, click on that, find out who else has signed up to be interested in that issue and working on it, exchange ideas, etc. So let me launch into my talk today, and I'm going to be trying to open 3 windows for us onto the subject of nonviolence. And these will be in the form of 3 questions. The first one is, what did Gandhi and King discover? The second question is, what has been done with it since then? And the third question is, where can we take it now? And when I'm finished outlining, and I'm going to ask you to listen very carefully, because when I'm finished outlining these 3 questions, that you will then know everything that I know, and I will undoubtedly not be invited back next year. So I have to begin by saying my emphasis on Gandhi comes from the fact, well, it comes from 2 things. my life with my teacher, Eknath Ekshwaran, he knew Gandhi personally, and through him, through Ishwaran, I was able to understand that Gandhi was, on the one hand, much greater than I had thought, and on the other hand, much more accessible through disciplines like meditation. Now, as for his greatness, this is an audience in which I do not hesitate to say the following. Not all audiences are like that. But I believe that Gandhi and Jesus were, okay, I'm going to say it. I believe they were the same person. I believe they were incarnations or instantiations, if you will, of the same force, and that they came into history at exactly the same time. Jesus came into Palestine at a time when an advanced spiritual culture was about to be overrun by a much more secular, and I have to say, much more brutal and political culture. The Jews had discovered monotheism, and it hit into the fact that God was to be loved, and God could be worshipped through love, whereas the pagan religion, for all its intellectual brilliance, its worship of a fragmented Godhead through fear represented a step back in human evolution compared to what the Jews had discovered, and yet they were overwhelming the Jewish population through military force. Eventually they did that. But Jesus came on the scene, I believe, to rescue that idea. And I believe that Gandhi appeared in northwestern India, at exactly the same time, when an advanced spiritual civilization was about to be overwhelmed by colonialism from the West. So be that as it may, Gandhi is certainly a figure who repays study, and let's now get into my first question. To put it succinctly, I think what Gandhi discovered is that there is a power in the human being, meaning in every one of us, that can be developed, that can be harnessed. Dr. Lafayette referred to it as a transforming power, and when developed and when harnessed, this is potentially a power that can resolve everything. It can resolve every problem that we're facing in our world, and I mean individual, familial, social, international, and so forth. And that's because every problem that we're facing can be said to arise from violence. And therefore, every problem can be set right through nonviolence. Because, as Gandhi said, nonviolence is not the inanity it has been taken for down the ages. Doesn't mean if you go out and hold up a sign and say, I'm against X, Y, and Z, and then go home, either having been tear gassed or not having been tear gassed, that you have exhausted the potentiality of nonviolence. The etymology of himsa, the word for violence, means the urge to injure another. That arises, I'm adding this now to the etymology, that arises from the perception of disunity, the fundamental wrong belief that I can build my happiness on your suffering. And because that belief is false, we have a very strong ally in the truth, and this is why Gandhi said that truth and nonviolence were the opposite sides of the same coin. So overcoming that falsehood would solve every problem that we're now facing. I know this is a big statement, but I'm sticking with it for the time being. And more than that, more than just solving, let's say, the crime problem or the economic problem, it could really unlock our spiritual potential, which has been locked up by the commitment to violence in one form or another, by that name or some other, which has been imposed upon us by this culture created and propagated through the mass media. So the question then is, if Gandhi and Jesus are, as Nagler thinks they are, evolved human beings who have developed this power, what kind of power is it? I'll approach it anecdotally. This is a little-known story, but toward the end of Gandhi's life, in the mid-40s, he got involved in an issue in his home region of Gujarat of reforming the regime of a Maharaja. A lot of these princely states, Maharajas in India, and they were being called upon now to move towards democratic reforms. Some of them didn't like it. Funny thing. And he went to a meeting with some of his fellow ashramites, inhabitants of the ashram. They walked several miles to go to this meeting, but they didn't know that the Maharaja had hired some thugs, known in India as gundas, to break up the meeting. So in the middle of the meeting, suddenly these guys emerge out of nowhere, and they're beating people with lathis, and yelling and screaming. Pandemonium breaks out. And the person who records this story immediately thinks to himself, where is Bapu? Where is Gandhiji? He looks around the crowd, he spots Gandhi, and he sees Gandhi trembling. And he says to himself, I thought Bapu was immune to fear. What's going on? He ran over to him to stand by him and to see what was going on. And when he got close enough to him, he could see that it was not fear that Gandhi was trembling from, but revulsion. The sight of all this violence just was turning his guts inside out. He collected himself, Gandhi did, and as usual in these extreme situations, all unforeseen, he came up with a brilliant solution, which never would have occurred to me in a million years. He immediately said to all his friends who had come with him from the ashram, go back home, leave me here alone. So they turned around and left him, a frail person, about the same size as me and Betsy, only with less teeth and even less hair than I have, all alone with these gundas. And of course, as soon as they saw what he had done, so he was so helpless and so vulnerable, they felt kind of abashed, and they fell into a conversation with him. Gandhi said, okay, what is your problem? They said, hey, well, we don't actually have a problem. We're hired thugs. We beat people. So he said, well, look, because you don't have a problem, maybe you go home and I'll go home. And they said, that's fine, Bapuji, but it's a dangerous road between here and the ashram, and I think you're going to need an escort, and we should accompany you. So, there are many, many stories like this, and I would like nothing better than just to stand up here and tell you them one after another, but I'm getting the high five from Betsy. The point we should take from this story is this, that the power of renunciation and vulnerability is greater than the power of threat and alienation. And learning how to discover that power, we will be able to overcome the forces of threat and alienation in our world. To give you another insight into how this works, something happened in California not long ago. We have a lot of shopping centers, and this old and slightly disabled lady was getting into her car, and a young man jumped into the car and pointed a gun at her and said, give me all your money. And she said to him, young man, Jesus is with me in this car. He's always with me. If you shoot me, I'm going straight to heaven, and you're going straight to hell. He was stunned. They fell into a conversation, and within minutes he was crying, put his gun away, and made haste to get out of the car. And she said, wait a minute, young man, and gave him all the money that she had, which was $10. So without knowing it, and I guarantee you this woman did not take my course, without having any way of knowing it, she carried out the precise scenario of nonviolent resistance to an unforeseen threat to the letter. She said to this person, I will not give you a dime if you're threatening me. You're going to have to kill me first. But when you stop threatening me, I'll give you all you want. That's perfect. Absolutely no fear, but absolutely no disrespect, no revulsion for that person. She didn't say, you blankety blank, you're going to hell. She said, if you shoot me, you will be falling from your own stature and going to hell. So how can we paraphrase this interaction? In a way, the young man is saying, I offer you my vision of separateness, where my fulfillment depends on you losing yours. And she is saying, no, thank you. I offer you my vision of unity, where, as Martin Luther King said, I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. And you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. So this is an entirely different vision of life, which if we only could stop and focus on it a little bit, it could take over. So it's this discovery of this force, which Kenneth Boulding called integrative power, and which St. Augustine said taps into our human nature, our desire for connectedness as far as possible with everyone else. And in practice, it played itself out in a number of rules that Gandhi followed. One was called no fresh issue. As soon as you start to get some leverage over somebody, you don't then pile on other issues that they hadn't thought of. And if in the film, in Attenborough's film, you may remember there's a scene where the person playing Jan Smuts says to him, I'm going to give you this concession, but I'm afraid we're also going to have to block immigration. And Gandhi says, that was not an issue on which we fought. Now that we have, and you look at him very carefully, read my lips, as a famous American vice president once said, read my lips. He was about to say, now that we have won, but he catches the look on Smuts' face and he stops himself. No triumphalism, no winning, no losing. He said, now that we are in a position of advantage, I cannot introduce it. The point behind no fresh issue is that if you introduce a fresh issue and you have a little power, you're reducing the conversation to the level of a power struggle. Thanks, Betsy. And nonviolence can always be looked upon as a conversation where you may have to resort to action when words don't work. Another technique that he developed was called non-embarrassment. Our idea is wait until your opponent is weak and then hit him with everything you've got. His idea was if your opponent is weak, back off. And he did that with brilliant success in South Africa when there was a railroad strike by the European workers. He said, okay, the satyagraha is over, and it was for the time being. His co-workers said, you're crazy, now we can really, he said, nope, we do not play by those rules. And that was so much appreciated that within a year, they had everything they were asking for. And he did it even more dramatically in 1926 in the attack that you've also seen in the film in Chowri Chowra. He called off the biggest social movement that had ever been seen because it was not quite nonviolent enough. Now, his biggest invention, though, was something called constructive program. We're going to go into that in a little bit, but basically it means that you go ahead and build the world you want without waiting for other people to give it to you. Now, I neglected to mention at the beginning of my talk that I'm going to follow the following format, which is to stop at the end of about 20 minutes of presentation on each of these questions. And I wish I had told you this ahead of time, because you would have cooked up a few. To take about 10 minutes for interaction and questions before we go into the next talk, which are what are the quantitative and qualitative advances since Gandhi. So I have now pulled a fast one on you, and I do apologize. But I am going to stop now for a few minutes. And if you have any questions, what shall they do with the questions, Betsy?
Okay, I'm just going to facilitate the questions. We do need to end this program at 3, so unfortunately, we're having to cut short a little bit of presentation and a little bit of questioning time all along the way to meet that goal so that everybody can get to their workshops. But so now is the opportunity. If anyone has any questions, looks like the mics in the hall disappeared, so please stand up and speak loudly, and if necessary, I will repeat the question. This is our opportunity to have some conversation. Yes?
How would you see Jesus in Jerusalem for the last time, seeming to press the conflict with the religious leaders?
How would you see Jesus in the last days seeming to press the conflict with the religious leaders?
Well, if he really did that, and honestly, as my scholar friends tell me in Berkeley, it's very hard to get traction on what actually happened. But assuming that he actually did that, it's not out of line with nonviolence, because you often will push an issue to get a response from the opponent, especially when you are in a position of strength. And if you may remember that one of the times when Martin Luther King was really flummoxed was in Albany, Georgia, because the police captain Pritchett had caught on that if they reacted, he would use that reaction against them. So they just sat there and did nothing. And he had to be pretty creative to provoke a response. So it's not unlikely perhaps Jesus knew that the end of his physical life was at hand, and he had to bring this thing out into the open. He had to create, in fact, what we call a nonviolent moment. A nonviolent moment is where these forces have been jostling, the force of truth and the force of disunity, and they get into a position where they come head to head. And in those moments, especially if you've prepared your steps carefully, nonviolence will always prevail. So as a general rule, you don't seek confrontation, but there are times when it's required and appropriate. That was a good question.
Other questions?
Uh-huh.
You did not understand no fresh issue? Okay.
Yeah. Yes, let me give you an example. In the Solidarity movement in Poland, they had been working for 10 years, and they finally got the very oppressive regime to a position where they were willing to negotiate. In fact, they were willing to sign a document. They had won, so to speak. At the last minute, someone rushed in on Lech Walesa with a message saying, add this issue. We want complete amnesty for everybody who's been arrested. So Walesa said, okay, I have to add another issue here. And his opposite number said, well, then the conversation is over. He got up and walked out. So if you are negotiating with a person and you have to do it through action, dramatic resistant action sometimes, and you get them to where you want them, you don't then jump on them and say, ha, now I'm going to ask you for something else. If you do that, then you're reducing that relationship to a power struggle from a conversation. And the whole point was your opponent had thought that it was a power struggle. You're trying to educate him or her that it was actually a conversation between equals.
Okay, last question.
It's called Walden Pond. Yes, there's a place for Thoreau, but not the place that most Americans think that he occupies. We like to say that he got it from Thoreau, but the reality is that he got it from his own background and from his own experiences. He was absolutely thrilled to discover Thoreau because he thought that no one in the West had ever hit upon nonviolence. We know, where would he have seen any of it? But he was always delighted to find things in the West which were reflections of his discoveries. But he explicitly said, I did not get this idea from Thoreau. He did take the term civil disobedience from Thoreau. And he went on to add to that and say, for disobedience to be nonviolent, it has to be civil. Because I say this because we had an event in California not long ago where a law was passed against a certain type of assault rifle, and 5,000 Californians who owned that type of assault rifle refused to hand them in, and that was characterized by some people as an act of massive civil disobedience. That was an act of uncivil disobedience. All right, well, let me go on now to the quantitative and qualitative advances that have happened since Gandhi and King. But I have to warn you that it's a little bit like what William James said about Plato. I'm sure you remember. James, he said, every place I go in my mind, I meet Plato coming back. Similarly, every time I hit upon what I think is a brand new, wonderful discovery in nonviolence, I discover Gandhi already did that. That's all right, I don't mind. But first, quantitatively, even before Arab Spring, which as we were hearing this morning on the panel, was at least partly nonviolent in the case of Tunisia and Egypt, that even before those events, more than half the world's population lived in a regime which had experienced a major nonviolent event. I mean, major on the scale of an insurrection, an uprising, or a major reform movement. So 3.6 billion people out of 6 billion people at that point in time. So this thing has spread tremendously, and we would be much more aware of it if we had mass media that were capable of putting this into their radar software. So similarly, there are Gandhian actions that are going on even in India today. Say there's a certain amount of tongue-in-cheek. There are successful actions against corporate takeovers in various industries in the south. There's the tree-hugging movement in the Garhwal Himalayas in the north-central part of India, which has prevented logging that was destroying the environment. And there's a very important movement going on right now to prevent the building of a nuclear plant, which is very near the coastline, which was inundated by the last tsunami. But I don't want to stress the quantitative changes too much. I want to talk about the qualitative ones. One of the biggest and most important advances since Gandhi and King is systematic learning. If you read any of the literature about the peace movement up until about 1980 or so, people will always lament the fact that every time there's an uprising or an event, you have to reinvent the wheel. You have to go out and discover whoever did this before, or even worse, you don't even bother. You just go out and make the same mistakes. But for the first time in history, people are making a systematic attempt to reduce nonviolence to a science, as Gandhi said, and to disseminate it. So there were people who were part of the Utpor rebellion in Belgrade in the year 2000 who were in Cairo telling the Cairenes how to do it. And this kind of thing is going on all over the world. Metta has taken over a project from a very large organization called Nonviolent Peace Force. There's a training project, and we have been involved in setting up something called the Shanti Sena Network, which will be training centers for people who want to do third-party interventions in the US and Canada. And we're systematically perusing what are the best practices of this type of activity that have gone on throughout the world and transmitting it. That may seem like, well, duh. I mean, isn't that sort of what you do? Yeah, but in nonviolence, nobody has done it because we didn't realize that nonviolence was something that you can learn. It's also something you can do, of course, but it's something that you can learn. I know that for a fact. I have given like 59 final exams in nonviolence, and in some cases, those students learn something. Third thing, after the quantitative change and systematic learning, we now have new institutions that really hadn't been put in practice before. And one of them, and Betsy played a role in, is called third-party nonviolent intervention. Now it's actually called unarmed civilian peacekeeping. And what that means is that you have a group of trained people who are volunteers or else they're getting some kind of subsistence pay. They're usually international. They are either faith-based or they're not, or they're mixed. And what they do is go into situations of intense conflict and mitigate that conflict substantially, partly just by being there as a third party and breaking down the psychological miasma of me against you. And people have been carrying this on now since about 1980 in a systematic way. They have saved many lives. They've rescued child soldiers in Sri Lanka. Mel Duncan, who set up Nonviolence Peace Force with David Hartso, was just telling me that they have succeeded in brokering and keeping in place the ceasefire in Mindanao, which is a conflict I know has been going on for a long time because my grandfather fought in the Philippines in 1902. So this Moro insurrection has been going on for a while. But Mel shared with me that there's now a PBS documentary on them, and when he went in, there was a split in the Moro Liberation Front between the people who wanted to maintain the ceasefire and the people who didn't. So suddenly these camera crews are showing up in the jungle, and it was said it was very funny to see all these hardened guerrilla fighters with their ragtag uniforms and ad hoc weapons coming out and taking their cell phones and taking pictures of the cameramen to send home and show their friends. That's only one of a number of new institutions. I might mention some that are coming down from above also, like R2P, if you've seen references to that, the right to protect. There's an informal consensus now, not quite written into law, that if a population is not being protected in their own country, the sovereignty does not prevent you from going in and protecting them. Another thing that's come along are the introduction of new communities into the playing field, and you know that this can be tremendously important. It tilted the balance in South Africa when suddenly women and laborers joined the Satyagraha. It was a tremendous advantage and led to a successful conclusion. Now, for the first time in history, indigenous people are able to make their needs known in the larger world without losing their indigenous culture through organizations that they have collected together. And I think the women's movement has played a very important and very powerful role here also, bringing new voices. The fifth new development that I want to focus on is really exciting, and that is some kind of strange awakening, which will be studied someday. Someday someone will get a really good PhD out of this. What has happened to science? When I went to school, for example, and you know who's counting, but it was a while ago, I was told that a human being is basically a primate with flat fingernails, and that was it. So you know, I was saying, what am I doing in here taking a test if I'm basically a chimpanzee with flat fingernails? But the point I'm trying to illustrate is somehow it was the prevailing idea that science discovers truth through reductionism. You take Freud, for example. Let's take people when they're really sick and study them and derive from that a picture of what the human being is. Well, somehow, after the discovery of quantum theory in the early part of the 20th century, a wave has swept through the other sciences such that incredible discoveries are being made which are of tremendous benefit to help teach and educate about the theory and possibility of nonviolence. And I'll just mention two of them. One was a discovery that is so recent, it only took place in 1988 in Parma, Italy. How many of you have heard about mirror neurons? Okay, now let me tell you something. Those of you who did not put your hand up, the neurons that would have caused your arm to go up in the air were firing because you saw Phil and those other people putting their hand, because you're watching me do that now. Those neurons are firing in your brain and your central nervous system. Fortunately, there's another set of neurons called supermirror neurons, which intervenes and says, oh, no, that's not me, that's somebody else doing it. I don't have to go through that motion. So similarly, let's go back to that case of the old lady in the car. The young man comes in and he's in a mental framework of violence, fear, and aggression. He expects to see that mirrored in that woman. Instead, she comes at him with a totally different mindset. Now, in days gone by, we used to just say, it affects him. And we can show you examples where that worked. Then people would say, yeah, but there are also examples where it did not work, and no one can deny that. But my theory is that violence sometimes works, and it never makes things better. But nonviolence also sometimes works, but it also makes things better. But now you don't have to read my book. You should, of course. But mirror neurons say that this woman, what she was doing to that person was, yeah, appealing to his conscience and all the rest of it. All those things play a role. But she was actually triggering neurons in his nervous system, which produced a new mindset and new behaviors. Now, that doesn't mean he was compelled to carry out those new behaviors. There's always that quirky human element. They can say, hell no, I'm not going along with this. My ego doesn't like it. But we can now show that there actually is a neural pathway so intense that, as some scientists say, we are wired for empathy. And I interviewed a scientist in UCLA, which already was a nonviolent thing to do. You know, here I am, a Berkeley professor going down to UCLA. I think I deserve some kudos for that. So I interviewed Dr. Iacoboni, and I posed him this question. I said, what do you think would happen to us if all the violence were off the mass media for 1 week? We'd have no violent conversations, no violent imagery. What do you think would happen? He said, it would never come back. If we could just clear the air for a certain period of time, it would never come back, because that is not what we are designed to live for. Let me just mention one other experiment, and again, I'd love to go on and on with this, but in the realm of animal behavior, there's a scholar by the name of Frans de Waal, obviously Dutch, but he functions in Chicago these days, who performed an experiment. And by the way, he has written about 7 books. One of them is called Chimpanzee Politics. When I first saw the title, I thought it was a study of the White House, but it's actually politics among chimpanzees. In one of his books, he describes how they did this experiment where they had a colony of rhesus monkeys, well known from blood type experiments, but it turns out that rhesus monkeys are pretty aggressive. And they had a colony of stump-tail monkeys who are very pacific. And they said, what would happen, I would never do this, but these are professional scientists. What would happen if we put these kind of wimp, stump-tail, defenseless, helpless monkeys in with those vicious rhesus types? So they did it. And to their amazement, the rhesus monkeys were pacified by the stump-tail monkeys. The rhesus monkeys would come over and go, you know, I'm real aggressive. And the stump-tail would say, would you like to bite my finger? And they would go away. And not only that, but not only were the rhesus completely stump-tailized in the course of this experiment, but they then pulled the stump-tail monkeys out and wanted to watch and see how long it would take for the rhesus to go back to their bad old ways. Guess what? They didn't. Once they learned peace from their peaceful brethren, they actually liked it. I don't know what the other rhesus colonies have to say about this, but it shows you something that we've been saying in the field of nonviolence all along, and that is that peace and nonviolence are actually robust. These are robust systems. Let me see. Another experiment that will be of use to us here was conducted in Princeton. We have no rivalry with Princeton, so I get no extra credit for this one. But you may be aware of this unfortunate fact that if you are shown the picture, even a picture on a computer screen of a person who's in a different race from yourself, the amygdala, the amygdaloid nucleus in the limbic system will fire up. Now, I can see that you're not tremendously excited about this. You know, why should I care, you're saying? Because the limbic system, and especially the amygdala, is where the fight or flight response is triggered. So I'm sitting there, you know, I'm a Caucasian person, I'm from Brooklyn, but I am Caucasian. And I look, I see a face of somebody else, the amygdala fires off. Well, these 2 women professors at Princeton discovered that they thought this cannot be the whole truth. So they did a very simple thing. Before they showed the person the face, they said, we want you to tell us whether this person likes crunchy peanut butter or smooth peanut butter, whether they drink coffee or tea. Questions of that magnitude. And they discovered that that amygdaloid response, which they now have non-invasive ways of seeing which parts of the brain are firing off, it was just about completely suppressed. And how is that? Well, we nonviolence folks have been saying this all along, that hello, this is known as humanization, rehumanization. When I put a label on you and say you're black, white, or brown, or whatever, I'm not seeing you as a human being. But when I see you as an individual, which is what happens when I say, do you like coffee or tea, crunchy or smooth, then that labeling doesn't happen and you are fully human to me. So this is just one of many, many examples of these very exciting developments in science that have paved the way for much more profound education and much more convincing dissemination of nonviolence. So, in accordance with my scheme, and I hope you like it, we're going to stop again and see what kind of questions you may have for me.
Okay, are there any questions? Yes, in the back.
One of the other qualitative shifts, can you hear me?
Yeah.
It seems to me is in the work of Gene Sharp and what I think of the secularization of nonviolence to some extent. He maintains robustly that one needs to believe anything and not
Yeah. Oh, boy. How much time do you have? We're leaving at 12.
You want to repeat the question, Michael, or do you
Yeah,
want me to?
I can repeat the question.
Okay.
What about the work of Gene Sharp, which is a much more secular and rationalistic version of nonviolence than I've been presenting? You know, we're good at Metta. We're very good friends with Maria Chenoweth and Maria Stephan and Erica Chenoweth, who have just done a study that shows that in transitions to democracy, if they can be divided into violent and nonviolent, the nonviolent ones are literally twice as effective, twice as likely to succeed in 1/3 the time as the violent ones. I have absolutely no problem with this kind of work. You can do standard political science on nonviolence, but I do feel that, you know, I'm at an age in my life where I want to get it over with. I want out of here, you know? And I think that Gene's approach, while almost, I can agree on the factual level with everything that he says, and I even agree that it can be useful in some cases to say to some people, look, it doesn't matter what you believe, we just want you to behave nonviolently in this situation. That is useful, but it's not going to get us to the great turning. It's not going to get us to the paradigm shift. For that, we need a new image of the human being. Yeah. And I have said this to Gene, so it's not like I'm talking behind his back.
Okay, next question. Any other questions? Yes, in the back.
Yeah.
On the neuroscience developments, maybe you care to comment on attachment theory? I don't know how much.
Attachment theory?
You know, we're finding this sort of sense of almost, again, scientists telling us we're wired for community. We're wired for
Yeah. Yeah. Well, if I heard that question, I imagine everybody did. Okay, so the question is about attachment theory, which I really don't know much about, but it does show that we are wired for associability, for sociability, for wanting to make attachments and forming bonds and communion with one another, as St. Augustine said. And this, again, is very helpful. And I know that there have been experiments that show that if you do something which is even mildly altruistic, like you're playing prisoner's dilemma with a computer, your opponent is a computer or your partner is a computer. And instead of saying, haha, I'm going to get the maximum I can out of this move right now, you say, yeah, let me pull back a little bit and give the other guy a chance. The centers that fire off in your brain are the same that fire off when you're having, say, a drug experience, or what the scientists coyly refer to as intensely pleasurable experiences. So, in other words, we are wired for not just empathy, but what we used to call altruism. Yeah. Now, let me enter a cautionary note here. A lot of scientists, when they discover these connections, immediately leap to the conclusion that it's the neurons that are causing the pleasure or the experience or the sense of bonding. That's old paradigm. I think we have to say that in evolution, we have developed a system which responds to our deepest needs, the needs for bonding, autonomy, and meaning. Yeah.
Okay, one last question. Yes.
No one in the front of the room ever has questions. I wonder what kind of comment that is on my...
Yeah, that's right.
These, especially 5, 6, and 7, are these being used by the State Department and people who actually do try to do diplomacy, Carter Center, anybody who works in the area of peace?
Well,
Are these points, especially 5, 6, and 7, being used by anybody who works in peace, even the State Department?
I don't know whether it's being used in a practical way.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, as a general rule, I think one of the things that's changing in our world is that these structures that have been created to solve problems, they're not working. For example, in this development of nonviolent peace force, there were a lot of people who said the UN should be doing this. And I was one of the faction that said the UN is the last body in the world that's going to be doing this. They are the biggest bureaucracy on the planet. They're a bureaucracy of bureaucracies. But when we do it, they'll get interested. And as a matter of fact, UNICEF has just given $1.3 million, I think, to Nonviolence International. So I think this kind of innovation has to come from, quote, below, has to come from, you know, people and in groups, and it will percolate its way up to the top. I'm not opposed to its coming down from the top, but I don't see it up there. Yeah.
Okay, let's end the question center session then and on to the next section.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to very quickly, before we launch into what is the way forward in the second Obama presidency, here's my title, I'll just share with you just a little bit of a model here that we've developed at Metta. This term asat that you see in the middle there, but now you don't see it from my pointer, but right in the middle of this wheel is a Sanskrit term meaning unreality. And from this commitment to unreality, namely separateness, comes globalism, crime, consumerism, racism, war, and poverty. And what Gandhi did, in effect, this thing now, was create a whole system based on sat, or reality. And he came up with a concept or a model which turns out to be the perfect solution to that given problem. For example, you can't read it on the screen, but his devotion to what he calls Swadeshi, or localism, is exactly the answer to globalization. And that's kind of similar to what we were just saying, sir, in response to your question. I'd love to go around this whole wheel with you and spend more time with it. We used to call this the wheel of reality, but we got a little hipper now, and we just call it the real wheel. But we're going to put it on our website with an explanation. But what I was just talking about is there about 8 o'clock, the antidote to war is the Shanti Sena, or the peace army, where individuals come together unarmed and go into a place to bring peace to it, not to, quote, pacify it in the militaristic sense. Now, I'm going to be talking in a little bit about what the human individual can do in order to go forward, and I would ask you to keep these points in mind, which I'll run over very quickly. We have 5 suggestions that we make to individuals, and this is what we're trying to get things that individuals can do without them necessarily getting into groups and organizing and starting another 501c3. These are basic principles in nonviolence. Never act against the person, always against the problem. Be always ready to compromise, but never on principles. No fresh issue, we've mentioned before. No triumphalism, I touched on. And non-embarrassment, I'd like to expand now to say never use humiliation or accept it. And incidentally, this is one of the points on which Gene Sharp and I diverge, because they are willing to use humiliation because they're not aiming at restoring the relationship. They're aiming at getting rid of the situation. Okay. Now, one of the things that Gandhi came up with, and remember what William James said about Plato, one of the things that Gandhi came up with is he had 2 main ways of moving forward. One was called constructive program, where, oops, sorry about that. Constructive program, pushed the wrong button. They'd never trust me with a machine. And one was called satyagraha, or direct resistance. And most of the events that have happened since Gandhi and King have been either one or the other. So, for example, you have a good example of satyagraha in the Atpur rebellion that I mentioned a little while ago, where it was a student-instigated movement. In one day, it brought down the presidency, so-called, of Slobodan Milosevic. 11 weeks of NATO bombing had failed to do that. There's a very good scientific way of comparing the power of threat and intimidation with the power of vulnerability and renunciation. So they were perfect satyagrahis. There's a film about this called Bringing Down a Dictator, which comes from the Sharpian people, basically. But then what happened? Then what? Nothing. And soon enough, the same corruption started coming in. Gandhi had said, if you think you're going to get rid of the British and then fix India's society, you are dreaming. First, we fix Indian society, and then the British will be a pushover. Now, if they had able to do that, then what happened in Egypt could have been prevented, what happened in Serbia could have been prevented, this backsliding after the successful overthrow of an unwanted regime. On the other hand, we have a few movements which are all constructive program and don't know how to deal with conflict. One of the largest in the world is the MST, or the Landless Workers Movement in Brazil, which has given land to tens of thousands of families of homeless peasants, and they've created whole civilizations in these new little latifundia that they've, these are settlers basically, but a good kind of settlers. And, but on the other hand, if you go and see the film about them, which is called Raiz Forte, or Strong Roots, what you see is when they are attacked, and they are, by police or paramilitaries, landowners, the Brazilian equivalent of gundas, they just go into a panic. They fly all over the place, or worse, they throw stones and sticks at the police and make things even worse. So that's an example of constructive program, one of the best I've ever seen, but no satyagraha. And on the other hand, we have many examples of satyagraha without constructive program. So Gandhi had both wings, and he had something else. He had a strategic command of the situation. So we like to say, and Stephanie found this Picasso image for us here, what we like to say is for true nonviolence to really change things for the better, forever, you need two wings and a brain. You need to know how to do constructive program, how to do direct resistance, or satyagraha, and when to do which, how to choose between them. And we have never seen that since Gandhi's day, but we're going to see it now. If you'll give me a minute to change over here. Okay, what I'm going to walk you through now is our latest and greatest invention at Metta Center, which is called the Roadmap. You'll see it blow up of it in the back there. It's what the screen is trying to say is from spontaneous protest to unstoppable movement, a comprehensive strategy. We have millions of projects going on all over the world. It's fortunate I know what these slides actually say, so I can fill it in for you. You have Occupy, prison reform, Move to Amend against Citizens United, Stop the XL pipeline, et cetera, et cetera. Free. They're just popping up all over the place, thanks to our very clever animator. But what we don't have, the big question, how can they be brought together into a single, and it's not a stoppable movement that we want, it's an unstoppable movement. It's just. And if you have read Paul Hawken's book, Blessed Unrest, he figures that there are 2 million organizations in the world, not people, organizations, doing each one of them something wonderful. But a movement is not coming out of that for various reasons that we could go into. But how do we bring them into, woohoo, one movement? Well, we want a unified, nonviolent approach to what Joanna Macy and others have called the Great Turning. Here's how it would look. It would be based on person power, go on to have constructive program elements, and from there, finally, into satyagraha, or direct action. The term person power is an invention of ours. People power was coined in 1986 in the Philippine insurrection, and where we stand is that there's an incredible unstoppable power within the human individual, and we need to be developing that also. I'm now going to go somewhat quickly through this, the rest of this diagram, try to give you the basic ideas and invite you to participate. So to start with person power, We think that there are several ways that we can develop it. One is to get a spiritual practice if you don't already have one. And as Frank mentioned, we'll be doing a couple of workshops on passage meditation, which is kind of our staff pick for the kind of meditation that we like to promote. We have here, beware the corporate media. I actually would not hesitate to go so far as to say, boycott the whole enchilada. You know, I have never owned a television set in my entire adult life. And look at me, you know, strong, healthy, could win a wrist wrestling contest maybe with a 10-year-old. To just briefly, I would say the imagery, the selection of the news, the dedication to if it bleeds, it leads, has really, as we were saying this morning, it has overwhelmed education, it has overwhelmed religion, and has really blocked the possibility of spiritual progress. You would lose nothing by just not participating in that at all. What you will find is that you have a big cultural space in your mind, and we, funnily enough, we recommend, whoops, wrong button again. We recommend that you can fill that space by learning about nonviolence. Because it is a complete subject, it starts with a new image of the human being and goes on to the techniques of interaction with the text, the meter maid, and everybody in your life. And finally, practice personhood by being more personal in your interactions with people. Someone we were talking with yesterday was talking about a really unhappy scene where there's, I guess, a whole subway car. Everybody in that car is either looking at their iPad or their iPhone or listening to their Walkman, and nobody is interacting. A friend of mine years ago went into PG&E to talk about his phone bill. They said, go over to that desk over there, somebody will help you. He went and sat down and said, now dial the following number. So he dialed the number, picks up the phone, and he's having this conversation with this guy, and there's some kind of funny echo going on. He turns around. He's sitting right behind him, you know, the other side of the table. But God forbid you should have human contact. It's got to be mediated by machines. So if we try to find ways of interacting humanly with one another, looking for opportunities for service, we'll be making a substantial contribution at a very fundamental level to overturning the system that we don't like. Now, in constructive program, here are the features of it. You build community with like-minded others. You build the world you want. You supply your own needs, as people do through farming and other types of community. And you win over the public. The point that I want to make with this last item is, well, let me take an extreme example. The Sendero Luminoso in Peru, very powerful guerrilla group. They showed that they could kill anybody. And the end result of that was that the Peruvian people did not want them. And what good is a guerrilla movement without a popular base? On the other hand, if you look at groups like Hezbollah, I'm afraid to say, or Hamas, they are doing a lot of good by supplying things that the community needs and then saying, let's get rid of the oppressor. So if we had a well-developed constructive program where we could supply our own needs, break our dependency on, let's say, corporate rule, we would be able to show the world that we can do without corporate rule, which right now we can't do. We stand up and we say, get rid of the big bad corporations, and people say, okay, how am I going to fill my car? You know, where am I going to get clothes from? So that was Gandhi's point. We first weave our own cloth with our own cotton. Then we say to the British, we don't need you anymore. So, okay, as I say, I have to move a bit quickly through this, but I hope you're getting the general idea. Moving on to Satyagraha, if you've done personal development and constructive program, you will be trained and prepared to move into resistance where that is called for. And you're going to, because you've been studying nonviolence, you will be able to resist in an appropriate way and with appropriate intensity. On page 108 of Search for a Nonviolent Future, and don't worry, I don't know the book by heart, there is a very nice curve called the escalation curve, And just having this in mind, you'll be able to see that very often in our movements, we overreact or we underreact. For example, during the run-up to the Gulf War, the second Iraq War, a massive number of people said, we don't want this thing to happen. And George Bush said, oh, that's just a focus group. I don't have to pay any attention to them. What he was saying is, to us, though we didn't know how to hear him, was the time for petitions is over. They have to be backed now by obstructive action. Not having that whole strategy in view, we were stumped and the war took place. I'm not blaming us. Not everybody can take my course. Okay, let me move on. So we have divided this wheel into 6 wedges that we call them. And on the very top, we have something called new story creation. And I want to emphasize the power of that possibility. Here's a quote. What liberals and progressives don't seem to understand is that you don't counter a myth with a pile of facts and statistics. You can only counter a myth with a more powerful story. And David Bohm, the quantum theorist, said, our general way of thinking of the totality of the universe is crucial for the overall order of the human mind itself. And finally, Buckminster Fuller said, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. So that's what New Story is about. That's why we're stressing it. And that's why Metta's own contribution in the months to come will be on developing and disseminating a new story, where creation comes from, what human beings are, etc. Then we'll move on to really important things. And of course, peace creation, democracy and social justice, the vibrant and sound economy, and climate protection and the environment. They could have been lumped together, but because of its urgency, we gave climate protection its own wedge. And in each case, we have some general considerations, and we divide them into sub-wedges. Like in new story creation, it's research, media, and education. Our general idea is that the 6 wedges are probably workable. The sub-wedges are, more or less arbitrary. What we're hoping people will do is come to our site when it should be ready in maybe a few weeks, and you'll see that there are 4 sub-wedge possibilities. The 3 that we've proposed, or one called Other. So people can put in what they think should be included. Some examples are the Earth Charter, Education for Daily Living, which is a program of our teacher, Eknath Easwaran. Non-reductionist science that's coming up so strong now. And then in peace, similarly, we have unarmed peacekeeping, which is what I've been talking about, third-party nonviolent intervention. Peacemaking, which means diplomacy and the resolution of problems that led to the conflict. And peace building, which is the actual reconciliation of communities. Betsy, how are we doing on time? In time to stop? Oh my gosh. Well, I hope you're incredibly intrigued. Rather than, I think you get the basic idea. You can see it spelled out a little more on the chart in the back, and as I say on our website, in a few weeks we're going to have this thing in an interactive modality. So, now those questions that you have been hoping to ask all along.
Yes, in the back.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the question was twofold. What are we going to do about all of this competitiveness? Mm-hmm. And I say we should outcompete it. And is there a soft landing for, or planned obsolescence for a corporate structure? I think that it is possible to tame competition. And this I learned directly from my teacher. I never would have found this on my own. And that is, we all are born with a competitive instinct, and we can assume that everything that we are born with is there for a reason. So what is the purpose of our competitive instinct? It is to compete against ourselves for improvement. I want to be a better peace educator today than I was yesterday. I do not want to be a better peace educator than Betsy Kreitz, which is impossible, anyway. And I know that in all of the domains that you mentioned, even football, which has been called a perfect combination of nonviolence and science. There is a high school football coach in Maryland who has decided that he will have his boys learn how to play terrific football without competing. And when those fellows trot out onto the field, you know, with their armor clattering about them, as Homer says, he has them chant, you know, what is our job? And they say, to love one another. And he says, what is my job? He says, to love all of us. And, you know, they shake hands with the other team. And this, the amazing thing, and if you haven't studied nonviolence, this will be truly amazing. The amazing thing is that they have won their league every, I think, the last 5 years out of 7. So put your bets on nonviolence. I've always said, peace research, that's where the money is. Yeah.
Okay, any questions?
And as for the corporate question, I think I would love to take about an hour and a half now and talk about Gandhian economics, but that you wouldn't love that. So what I would just like to say is the problem with our economy is that we're asking it to do something that it cannot do. It cannot make us happy, fulfilled human beings. That has to be sought elsewhere. And once we see that that purpose of economics is just to keep goods and services flowing and not to compete with other countries, not to run over a fiscal cliff every 15 years and so forth, then those things will shrink down naturally, and what we now today call type B corporations, where they have a triple bottom line, people, profit, and planet, and Mondragon cooperatives and things like that, showing that you can get together and manufacture complicated things without having the corporate mentality, which is so sick. But we have to change the mentality first. Then the corporations will redesign themselves. Yeah.
Okay, one more question. Anybody? Way back in the back? Yeah, waving your arms. Oh, over here.
Oh.
Sue? Nope.
You're very welcome. The question is that the movement in the US anyway seems to be heavily white and male, and as a white male, would I comment on that? No, that wasn't part of the question, that was just part of the joke. You know, I think it's partly that we haven't liberated ourselves from the old ways of thinking as much as we'd like to think. I remember having an argument with the Eugene anarchists. I was shipped up to Eugene, Oregon by train to argue with these guys, and I shocked them by saying, the trouble with you anarchists is you're not radical enough for me. Them's fighting words for anarchists. And I said, the reason I'm saying that is you're willing to get rid of time and money and things like that, but you're not ready to get rid of violence. And violence is at the very core of our system. Until you're ready to change that, you're really not radical in the accepted sense, in the original sense of the word. So I don't think many of us have gone deeply enough to completely shed all of those prejudices, if you want to call them that. But I also think it's partly just because to study nonviolence, unless you fall into it the way Dr. Lafayette did, to study nonviolence is a luxury. And for that, you have to feel sort of privileged and have some time and leisure. And I personally think that the correct attitude towards privilege is not necessarily to get rid of it, certainly not to feel ashamed about it, but to use it. In other words, Gandhi had this incredible concept called trusteeship, which he thought could replace ownership. And with an idea of trusteeship, if I have a privilege, which in some cases I do, I had the opportunity to get an education and so on and so forth, would I use that education for the benefit of others? Or would I use it for a degree or for some subtle psychological strokes, like getting Betsy Kreitz to tell about how many languages I know and things like that? So thank you. Once again, that was a very good question. We have a few of these roadmap brochures and some postcards at the back, and I know we all have to get off to our workshops. It's been absolutely a delight talking with you, and I very much enjoyed all of your questions.
Thank you so much, Michael. And now that he's given us a roadmap, I say we start Metta Center East.
I got questions too, but I didn't have time to ask. Real quick.